All right, in this unit, we're going to be focusing on viruses. We're going to be looking at how we discovered them, their structures, the different, maybe some common types of viruses, and their how structures are different, how they can reproduce. Are they living? Are they not living? So those are the big things we're going to be focusing on with viruses. And then at the end, we'll go ahead and start looking at comparisons with viruses versus bacteria. But let's go ahead and get started. How we discovered viruses. Okay, up until the 19th century, early and middle 19th century, we didn't have a clue about what viruses were, what they did, anything like that. We knew about bacteria, and that was the smallest type of organism that we had known about using microscopes and those types of things. But in the end of the 19th century, there was a disease running through domesticated cattle that was used for farming and agricultural reasons. It was called the hoof and mouth disease. And what was happening is it was infecting the hooves of the cattle. It was getting into the mouths. It was causing problems, and it was eventually causing the cattle to die. And so scientists started looking at what the cause was, and they couldn't find bacterial with the normal processes that they had used. So they started digging deeper, and what they were able to do is they were able to isolate a pathogen um, within the cows. It was smaller than bacteria. It was differently shaped than bacteria, and it could not function by itself. Okay, it could not function isolated. It had to be a part of a host cell, a living cell, to be able to function. Whereas bacteria can grow, for example, within a petri dish, as long as it has a food source. Whereas this new organism or this new pathogen thing that was found, if it was isolated by itself and it was still given a food source like bacteria, but it was isolated by itself, it couldn't do anything. It couldn't reproduce, it couldn't grow, it couldn't spread. And so this was the initial discovery of viruses. And they termed these structures viruses, which in Latin it means poison. Okay, so they were able to find that they were smaller than bacteria. They did cause diseases, so they were considered pathogens because they caused diseases. And yet, even if they had a food source, if they were isolated from a living cell, a host cell, they were not able to reproduce and grow and spread. Okay. Um, Now this last part here at the bottom, back in the 30s, 1930s, we didn't actually know. Back in the end of the 19th century, we knew about a virus. We knew that they were out there because of this discovery. But not until the 30s did we actually dig deeper into viruses and discover their makeup and how they function. All right, and it was through the tobacco mosaic disease. There's a virus that attacks tobacco plants, stunts their growth, causes decay to happen more quickly. You're not getting the full production of the plant when this virus is attacking it. And so what they did is they were able to isolate this particular virus, okay, known as TMV, the tobacco mosaic virus. They were able to use the technology that had been developed during the up to the 1930s. They were able to identify structure. They were able to identify processes. So we really got a chance to look in depth at a virus with the work done on the TMV virus back in the 1930s. We found that it was just composed of a couple things: RNA, which was its genetic material, and protein. That's all that the virus had. Here's a picture of what the virus can do as far as the decomposition and stunting of the tobacco plant. So once this happened, there was technology advancement and a big leap forward within viral information as far as knowing structure components. We were able to study processes that the viruses went through and how they did these things. Okay, so let's actually start getting into the virus structure, the makeup. Um, Now, a virus is just a piece of genetic material. Say it could be DNA, it could be RNA. So it's just a segment of nucleotides or genetic material contained within a protein coat. So a structure that's going to hold that genetic material, and then some proteins. Okay, that's all the virus is made up of. And we're going to get into the differences between viruses that contain DNA as their genetic material and viruses that contain RNA. We'll get into that later. So that's just the basic layout of a virus. We know that they are extremely small, okay, a lot smaller than a bacteria, because we can see bacteria, a single bacteria, and colonies of bacteria using our light microscopes. Or viruses, you can fit thousands of them on the tip of a needle, for example. So they are extremely small compared to hundreds of times smaller compared to that of our smallest living organisms, which are bacteria. Most of the viruses that we know of, or all of the viruses, let's rephrase that, all of the viruses that we know of, except for maybe one or two, they cannot be seen using light microscopes like our bacteria can. Almost all of them have to use an electron microscope, usually a scanning electron microscope, so we can actually see the structure of it. That's how small these viruses are. Now, are viruses alive? Here's where we're getting into organisms. What are the characteristics of organisms? What do we classify organisms as far as do they have those characteristics to make them living things? Remember, we've talked about characteristics of living things way back at the beginning of the year. We just looked at kingdoms and the different kingdoms and the major components of those kingdoms. So are viruses alive? Well, here we go. We don't consider viruses living. And here are the reasons why. Think about the cell theory, and things that are living, they have to have certain criteria. First of all, the things that are living have to be made of at least one cell or cells. Like our bacteria are made of just one cell, but it's still a cell. And then you can have multi-celled organisms that are made of more than one cell. Viruses are not made of cells. They do not have a plasma membrane like every other organism on the planet, including bacteria. They do not have cell walls. They do not have cell organelles. They do not have cytoplasm within the cell. They have none of the structures that would make a cell a cell. So viruses are not made of cells. The second thing, they cannot reproduce on their own. Okay, bacteria can reproduce by asexual reproduction, so they can split apart through that process, or they can reproduce with other bacteria. Every living organism can reproduce and make more of itself, or at least pass on genetic information to make more of that species. Viruses cannot do that. They cannot make more of themselves. They cannot reproduce unless there are resources, or there are resources that, let's just say that, to do the job for them. Okay, the way viruses reproduce is they infect living cells. Okay, say for example the flu virus is going to infect living cells. It could be your throat cells, it could be your stomach cells, but it's going to choose some type of respiratory cell more than likely, or a digestive cell. It's going to take over that cell, and it's going to use the functions that cell, that living cell, usually goes through, like mitosis and meiosis and cell respiration. It's going to use those functions to reproduce the virus. So the virus cannot do any of that unless it uses a living cell to do those things. All right, the third reason why we don't consider viruses living is they can't maintain homeostasis. All right, they don't have an equilibrium with the outside environment and their internal environment. They can't adjust to those outside surroundings. Every living organism can do that. If you change the temperature, if you change some variable in the environment, they have the ability to adjust to be in equilibrium with their environment. Viruses can't do this. And then the fourth reason why we don't consider viruses alive is they can't metabolize, which means they can't take in a food source that contains energy, and they can't break that food source down to use that energy as their own. We metabolize, we eat food, we can break it down and we can take the nutrients from it and we can gain the energy from it and use that energy on our own. Every living organism can. Bacteria, plants, viruses can't do that. You supply them a food source and they do not have the ability to extract energy from that food source and use it as their own. So those are some of the reasons why viruses are not considered living. They're not made of a cell or cells. They cannot carry out normal life functions, replication, reproduction, energy consumption. They can't do any of these things unless they use a host cell. Okay, so if we're going to say that viruses aren't living, then where do they come from? Well, here's some ideas on the origin of a virus. Some scientists suggest that a virus used to be a part of a living organism or originated within a living organism and found the ability to move between organisms and not necessarily die off because it's not living, but as long as it can come in contact and infect a living cell, then it can be transferred. So I think that maybe some scientists think that it could have originated within living cells. So it could have maybe once been a living organism or a part of a living organism. We categorize viruses, if you want to give them a category, as a parasite, not as a living parasite, but as a non-living parasite that as long as it has a cell that it can infect, it can take over that host cell and reproduce. So once it can take over that host cell, it acts like a living organism. But it would use that host cell up until that cell dies, or that if it spreads through the whole organism, it would use that whole organism up until that organism dies. Okay, so I mentioned the word pathogens. Okay, we were definitely putting viruses in the pathogen category. There's not a virus out there that is not going to be considered a pathogen. We know pathogens. We've talked about them a little bit before, but here they are again. Pathogens are just agents or structures or things, however you want to look at that first word, that cause a disease. They cause an infection. They cause a disease that would cause an organism to react to that disease. Some examples, there are bacteria that are very good for us, and when we start talking about bacteria, we'll get into that. But there's also bacteria that cause disease, so those types of bacteria would be considered pathogens. Like if you've ever had strep throat is caused by a bacteria. That would be a type of bacterial pathogen. There are certain fungus that can be a bacteria as well. Athlete's foot. If you've ever had athlete's foot or know someone that's had athlete's foot, that's caused by a fungus. So that could be a pathogen. And then, of course, viruses. Every virus is going to fall in this category. All right, so we've talked about how large viruses are. I've given you examples as far as compared to the size of a bacteria, but here's some visual for you. Okay, if you look at this picture and you have the picture of a single bacteria, okay, and its size, Notice in the background you can see a section of an animal cell. You can see the plasma membrane. You can see the nucleus, the mitochondria, some of the other organelles inside a normal